Welcome to Poker Market, making poker more efficient.
What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. Welcome to part 2 of the Fundamental Theorem series. This video will be on the topic of value betting. So what can you expect coming up in this episode? Well, we're going to define value betting. We're going to talk about some of the common misconceptions regarding value betting. We'll have a demonstration of the expected value of value betting using an expected value calculator tool known as CREV. We're going to talk about the impact of bet sizing on our expected value. And we're going to have a look at some worked hand history examples. Let's start at the beginning then with a definition of value betting. This is one of the core concepts or fundamental theorems of poker. You absolutely need to know what a value bet is. At the very basic level, a value bet is a bet designed to get called by worse hands. We think we have the best hand, we think our opponent's going to pair us off with worse. We put a bet out there hoping our opponent will call, and we end up winning the pot. However, there are some formulas associated with this which must be taken into account. It's not simply the case that we can expect to sometimes get called by worse hands, and that's a good enough reason to value bet. The key concept here is that we must have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. And that's just the basic version of the formula, because there are scenarios where we might have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range, but it still ends up being a non-profitable value bet. This would be in a scenario where perhaps our opponent raises aggressively. But we want to start at the beginning. So let's assume that we are on the river, let's assume that we are value betting, and let's assume that our opponent is never raising, and let's start by assuming that our opponent is always going to call. So it's going to be a highly simplified model, but it makes sense to start with a simple model when we are introducing ourselves to a concept. Okay, so I'd like to introduce you now to CREV. As we mentioned at the outset, this is an expected value calculator. And we're going to use it to experiment with value betting and see what kind of results we get. The first thing we need to know is that we've modeled here for a river scenario. So we're ignoring any of the action on the earlier streets. However, we're going to assume that the board texture runs out Queen 9-5 rainbow, 2 of clubs on the turn, and 3 of hearts on the river. We're also going to assume that we are out of position and first to act in the big blind, whereas our opponent's on the button. We're going to assume that there are 100 chips already in the pot. And we're going to be betting half pot. And we're going to either assume that our opponent is not allowed to raise, or we're going to assume that we're all in. We're also going to assume that our opponent is not folding. Now that will of course influence the expected value if our opponent's going to be folding with some frequency. But we don't want to deal with things on a very subtle level just yet. We want to have a look at a very, very basic value bet model. We have ace-queen suited. That's the only hand we have in our range, so we specifically have that combo of ace-queen. And our opponent's going to be calling with